Internets, welcome back to another Sultans and Sneakers podcast. I'm your host, Maheen the podcaster, and on today's show, I am welcomed for his probably first ever podcast appearance. First of many, I hope, Dr. Hugo Mendez, assistant professor in New Testament and early Christianity at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels! Welcome, Dr. Mendez.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. It took us a couple of months to get this thing going. So I first heard about you on Dr. Bart Ehrman's blog, and he had mentioned that you're a young professor. You recently came to UNC. I guess you had come in, worked there for a couple of years before, but you're really knowledgeable about languages, and I want to get to that, and even more so than he is. And he's seen as someone who's very esteemed in his field. But starting off, man, I just wanted to kind of get your background a little bit. You are a New Yorker, if I understand, right?
Right, correct.
What part of New York?
Yeah, and that's kind of the key question, right? I dated this girl once who told me that the one thing that all New Yorkers have in common is that they always talk constantly about how amazing their part of New York is and how awful every other part of New York is.
Okay.
So I was born in Queens, but raised most of my life in Yonkers. So kind of, right above the Bronx, Hudson Valley, you get the Palisades view.
Okay. So one thing I'm interested in is, how do you guys pick your sports teams? Is it based on neighborhood or what?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So I'm a Mets fan. I'm I'm an Islanders fan. How do I do that? So when I was a kid, my mom was, she was flat out a Yankees fan from Reggie Jackson days, Thurman Munson, late 70s. And she certainly wanted to raise us as Yankee fans. But so I was right at the age where they had the first ever, regular season Subway Series. And it was Mets versus Yankees. And the Mets dropped 2 out of 3 of those games in that initial series. But for some reason, I went into that weekend, left it, and was utterly and completely a Mets fan. And everyone else in my family ended up following, younger brothers ended up becoming Mets fans. My mom converted, so to speak, to becoming a Mets fan. So at least in that case, I don't know what it is. I think, Mets fans are it's all star-crossed fate kind of stuff. So I'm not sure I really picked them. And then I think from there, it was just, you got to have the Islanders, blue and orange. Got to have the Knicks, blue and orange.
Got to keep the theme, right? And then
get the colorway, yeah.
Well, the thing is, and do you follow NFL at all? Are you a Giants or Jets guy?
So it's funny, right? So as a kid, I thought it was the stupidest thing that they played in New Jersey. And I never got over that as a kid. And so I can remember, I was thinking, what do we got? Buffalo, New England? What do we have? I kind of watched Steelers games growing up, and no, I can't say I've ever plugged into either of the 2 New York football teams. I don't dislike either of them. I don't love either of them. I think Met fans tend to align Jets because they used to share a stadium. They won championships in the same year, so they're both expansion teams in a certain kind of way, right?
Right. No, it's interesting. So you kind of got screwed a little bit, it sounds like, by your timeline, because I'm going to throw this out there. I don't know your age, but by doing some basic bio research, you were not born yet when the Mets won the 86 World Series.
I was a baby when the Mets won the 86 World Series, and not in a position to enjoy it, and totally screwed by Fred and Jeff Wilpon, the owners of the New York Mets, who have, of course, now sold the team. And so I am nothing but optimistic right now.
Okay. And now the Islanders had a great run in the 80s, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. That was before my time. That was strictly 81, 82, 83. Yeah, that's the dynasty.
So again, when the Rangers win in 94, you're like, yeah, whatever. And then the Yankees start their dynasty in the late 90s. I guess the Mets got to the World Series in, what was it, 2000? Was it the Subway Series?
Yeah, so I got to enjoy that, albeit on the wrong side of history, ultimately, with that World Series. But yeah, I got to go to games. I was a season ticket holder for the Mets in 2015, and so that was great because that was a pennant run. But yeah, it's been more disappointment than not, and it's Madoff scandal, ownership dysfunction. It's just the kind of lot of us all right now.
Is it a thing? Would you say there's some kind of demographic, like the kind of persona Like when you think of a Yankees fan, you're thinking like maybe Wall Street, maybe like that kind of vibe. And
Not actually from New York.
oh, is that true too?
I
Okay,
like part of it, yeah.
okay, yeah. Because I always thought it was like neighborhood. So like Queens, because Shea State out, because now it's City Field, but is Shea Stadium and City Field the same location?
Yeah, I mean, it's the parking lot, right, of one or the other.
Okay, now is that considered Queens?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's all Flushing, Queens.
Cool, cool. So Hugo, I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on how New Yorkers in general, as you perceive it, pick their fandom. Right? We talked about the Yankee fans and Wall Street, and you're saying just a bunch of imports, people who come to New York to go to work, and they're not really native New Yorkers. I bet a lot of Yankee fans would find that offensive. But anyways, I want to get your take on like what's your perception in general on how it works for you.
Yeah, so I think ultimately New Yorkers do it generationally. That's what I've always seen, in the sense that if I think about even just how my family is structured,
Yeah.
it's, folks, let's, just take baseball or something. The generation that lived through the 80s and the Mets, the big kind of Met teams of 86, 88, they're all Mets fans. The kids who grew up in the 90s, it's the Yankee dynasty, right? And I think it just kind of moves that way. I think you break it down. The Islanders are kind of a special case, right? They're Long Island, so they're very regionally tied. But I mean, just folks who grew up in the 80s, that's still part of the fabric of what hockey looked like. I mean, the Rangers went 4 decades or so without a Stanley Cup during that period. I think you could run that operation again and again, and kids right now in the Giants probably compared to kids in the late 60s with the Jets. So I think that's how it breaks down. Certainly when I was growing up, every kid in my middle school and high school was a Yankee fan. And yeah, I was the lone Mets fan, and I got all the Mets suck kind of,
Yeah.
and whatever else. But yeah.
As far as the Knicks, because the Knicks last went to the finals in '94, and you must have been pretty young back then. And they went 90. They played the Spurs. Sorry, I'm sorry. They played in the Spurs in the lockout year.
Yeah.
But the Knicks now are seen to be as a laughing stock. Just from ownership point of view, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's funny, right? Because I remember growing up how I would always get the taunts for being a Mets fan. Kind of like, why would you waste your time on the Mets? And like, I would just go back, well, why are you wasting your time on the Knicks, the Jets, the Rangers, the Giants? I mean, it's just, New York fandom is constantly bad luck, bad ownership. I mean, it's just kind of, most franchises just really have all of these very dry periods. The Yankees are kind of the exception in that. And they have their dry spells here and there, right? It's just nothing like what the Jets have seen since the early 70s.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, New Yorkers. It's just I think part of the fabric that we're all kind of in that.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast earlier today during my lunch break. Have you heard of a guy named Gary Vaynerchuk?
Mm-hmm.
So Gary Vaynerchuk, he's like an entrepreneur basically, right? And his goal in life, he owns a media company. He's from Jersey,
yeah,
and his goal in life is to own the New York Jets.
Okay.
So he's a diehard. He's a workaholic. He's worked like 6, 7. He talks about like hustle. But he says he's never missed a Jets play like live in like 30 years or something, right? But he says that he's also a fan of the Rangers and the Knicks, right? And I think he said the Yankees as well. But he said that like when the Rangers won in '94 and the Yankees won the first time in '96, it's been kind of like it's like whatever, because he enjoys the process. Like the struggle. Like right now, he's so gung-ho. He's gung-ho about the Knicks and the Jets. Because the Knicks last won it with the 70s, right?
Yeah.
So he's like, that's the process he enjoys. Sometimes it's like with fandom, I get it, because especially the NBA. I don't know. I think baseball, NFL, and hockey, you have more loyal fans, right? And maybe that's why, well, I don't know how it is in New York, but NBA, you have LeBron. People follow players like, LeBron fans. I was a Jordan fan as a kid.
Yeah.
I'm a few years older than you, but it's like, so I was a Bulls fan, even though I lived in Ohio. but I
Well,
stayed a
it's a
Bulls
sport
fan.
that concentrates individual performance so well, right? In a way that these other sports don't in the
The
same.
NBA, right, right. So I think people follow players, but to me, it's hard. It's been hard to differentiate, right? But there's this idea that, like, well, if you're following players and they're always good, they're always going to be on a winning team,
Mhm.
right?
Right, yeah.
And you're never going to really have to like suffer. Like,
Yeah.
there's this expected notion that as a fan, you're going to have to suffer for some. You should suffer,
Yeah. Well, and
right?
I think, I mean, and this will just, kind of rub salt in Yankee fan wounds, but I mean, it's the '04 Red Sox, right? I mean, it's just that
Right.
story is so much sweeter for the curse that preceded it. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's even, I think, kind of the example of it's worth it. It's fun. There is something so completely sweet. I mean, you could take those 5 Yankee World Series within so many years, around that, and it still isn't as sweet as '04, I think, for a Red Sox fan.
Absolutely. And same
So,
with the Cubs. Yeah. So I live in Chicago, right? So it's like when the Cubs won in 16, it was insane, right? But it's interesting that, like, I was gonna ask you, in New York, is it like when the Yankees win, do the if the Yankees are in a World Series and the Mets aren't, will Mets fans support the Yankees?
No.
No. Okay. It's not okay.
I mean,
So
the worst nightmare for us was 2008 when it was Phillies versus Yankees, and that was just a complete meltdown disaster. Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, if you kind of think of the breakdown of New York, right? There's like a third diehard Mets fans probably somewhere. There's like a third diehard Yankee fans, and then there's that kind of middle crowd or something. Those aren't obviously exact figures at all, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's like a large chunk of New York that's really just happy with any New York team winning.
yeah.
I'm sure there are, plenty of inter-team marriages that are, pretty
Right.
okay in making it work. But I think, oh God, yeah, as a Mets fan, you just gotta, yeah, you hate it.
Right. Are the guys like the people who say, well, I'm a Mets fan and a Yankees fan? That's kind of annoying, I bet.
I don't really ever see those people.
Oh, you don't see? Okay.
I don't think so, no. And I mean, these teams fight in every respect, right? They fight for the back pages of the New York tabloids.
Yeah.
I mean, and then you get these other teams that are like thrown in the mix, like New York City Football Club right now, the MLS
Right.
team, which Met fans don't tend to align with because it's partly owned by the Yankees. And,
Right.
it's just, yeah, it kind of does cut things down, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I want to get a little bit about your own like family background, and as we talk about ethnicity and faith, etc. What is your background? I mean, by your name, you can kind of tell you have some Hispanic or Latin origin.
Yeah, so my dad was born in Uruguay. My mom was born in Nicaragua. So they both came to this country. They were, first generation immigrants to this country. And yeah, they both, faith is a big part of how they met. I mean, they met in a Catholic church. So yeah, it was the Catholic church they were married in, the Catholic church I was baptized in, etc.
Okay. And I know we were talking offline about the how they kind of moved into more Protestantism. Is that right? Would you characterize that accurately?
Yeah, so neither of my parents today are, I mean, kind of cleanly identify as Catholic. Definitely not my mom, who is very much evangelical Protestant. My dad is sort of, he can do a few different things. He's sort of open to a lot of different opinions and will go to lots of different places. But they're both Christian. They're both very religious. That was always part of the fabric of the family. And yeah, no, they left the Catholic Church really when I was about 2 years old. So Hispanics, Latin Americans have had sort of a significant mass exodus towards evangelical Protestantism, partly because of, just not least, strong missionary pressure in Latin America, assimilating to the American context if they immigrated here. There are kind of a few different factors, but I mean, you think about like a country like Guatemala, which a half century ago was, for all intents and purposes, 100% Catholic, which is today 50% Catholic, and evangelicals are just a huge part of that landscape now. My family, in a certain sense, recapitulated some of that and drifting, towards Protestantism.
It's interesting that missionaries would concentrate their efforts on Catholic countries, because let me understand something. Let me maybe Catholics believe in the Trinity, right?
Yeah.
They believe that Jesus is God,
Yeah.
and that salvation comes through accepting Jesus, right? That Jesus died for the sins. So what's the pitch that missionaries have? Like, what is, like, when a missionary is coming to a South American country, what's their angle? That's what I want to understand.
Yeah, right. So certainly, I think in my family, if I think about the way that my family, the members who have moved towards Protestantism sort of reflect on this, they view the Catholic Church as still being too compromised, worldly, half pagan, whatever. I mean, I think that kind of traditional mold of, Protestant critiques that the Catholic Church is Christian, but not the fullness, complete kind of Christian. I don't know, that runs through my family. So for instance, I know that my grandmother, she was one of the kind of key figures in the transition towards becoming Protestant when she came to this country. And she just could not ultimately do the statues and the candles. And she read that as idolatrous under Protestant influence and dialogue. And so that kind of notion that, Catholics sort of have the truth, but they're still halfway wrong, just kind of runs through the family. I think there was also this contrast between, if you think about coming from countries where everyone is Catholic, you're going to see 1,000 different varieties of Catholic practice, from very good to very poor, disaffiliated, essentially, et cetera.
Sure.
So I think for a lot of Latin American converts to Protestantism, Protestant communities sort of represent something, I don't know how to put it, like holier. There is sort of a cultural difference, higher standards, especially if you think about the particular denominations that are really important in Latin America. Pentecostalism, which comes out of holiness Christian traditions that stresses personal morality, personal dress, all of these sorts of standards, compared to kind of the teeming mass of Catholics. Yeah, sure. It has a contrast.
Okay, because the way, as an outsider, the way I kind of like look at it is, see, Roman Catholicism, when can you say that the Roman Catholic Church was actually formed? Like, when would you date that?
Yeah, no, I mean, in the sense that the Catholic Church is one of several churches today that are, truly contiguous, I think, with Jesus. I mean, in the sense that, that there isn't a clear demarcation. There's no break. There's no founding figure. It's just one way that ancient Christianity evolved that survived today. I mean, institutionally, the Church of Rome had leaders going back to the first century. There's a line of bishops of Rome that we can trace at least to the 2nd century.
Right.
That's a pretty long time ago.
Yeah.
The same kind of thing you could say for, Orthodox Christians.
Yeah. Eastern Orthodox. Yeah. So when I hear, so I personally have found this kind of like this. I seem to find some kind of like, I'm trying to connect the dots here in this sense, because Protestants will talk about, like, Protestantism is basically tied to Martin Luther, right? Martin Luther seen from a layman's, but then they talk about, like, so for example, the Council of Nicaea, the ecumenical councils happen under the Roman Empire, and that's pretty much the Roman. And so when you ask a Catholic about certain aspects of the faith, they will rely on church tradition as a pillar, right? But it seems to me that Protestants are also like kind of cherry picking that same church tradition in a way. And then, but then not, because to me, it's like, what's your methodology? And you know what I'm saying? Like, I want to give you my take. So the Muslims, we have something similar, right? We have you heard of like Wahhabism?
Sure, yeah, of course.
Sure, right? So, which is also marketed as something called Salafism, right? Which, when I first became interested in religion, that's the method, that's the kind of way that's what I approached. That was what I embraced. And the pitch was that we are trying to get back to the original teachings of the prophet as understood by the early generations.
Right.
But and then the opposition within general like Sunni Islam is what they call the traditionalists, which is more what I ascribe to now. And then it would say, well, we have the chain of narrations, we have the unbroken chain back to the Prophet. But the Wahhabis or the Salafis, I would say Salafis. Wahhabi is a pejorative, so I don't want to use that term, but like it's a more recent phenomena, 200-300 years old. But then claiming with the claim that we are trying to go back, we're like trying to purify what the traditionalists did and what they screwed up,
Right.
and the innovations they brought in to the religion. And so that's kind of how I see it. You know, and then, but what I found out was the reason I left Salafism and kind of more and went back to and went traditional, you know, even though my family background, probably they were never like really had studied it to this depth. But when I, in America, the beauty was we had access to all the various things, and we kind of like, you know, but then you found out that there's politics behind things and whatnot. So that's kind of why I'm like, because I have Pentecostal friends, and when I'll ask them certain questions about certain doctrines, because they'll say we're biblical, yeah. And then we follow scripture, but then they will then quote the tradition of the church. But I'm like, but wait a second, isn't that a Catholic thing? Are you cherry picking that? Because not only will they, because it's one thing, like, so I've heard some Protestants will be like, you know, Catholics, we disagree, but at the end of the day, they're still saved. They're still Christians, right? But then some folks will be like, no, Catholicism is evil, and right, we've got to convert them, and they believe in stuff that's gonna get them to hellfire. You know what I mean? And that's what some of these Pentecostals are like. So I just find it interesting about how like people can like maybe pick and choose certain things to justify a belief, but then like, you know, I just want to get your take on that. You know, that kind of like, it's almost like cherry picking. It seems like people aren't using a consistent methodology in how they're interpreting their theology. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, right. You know, I'm always very sensitive to this because I never want to speak reductionistically about any of these traditions.
Right.
But I mean, there is kind of, I think, a core difference in that, you know, Protestantism has a restorationist gene, ultimately, right? It really is about trying to purify the church, press the reset button, get back to what Jesus originally taught, what the Bible says, in a kind of unmediated sort of way, right? Certainly, at least in some varieties of, you know, here thinking about, you know, Protestantism.
Sure.
And yeah, right, where I think the Catholic imagination is very much, we are tethered to those realities, but completely in a way that's mediated through history, in a way that has unfolded in history, and that middle history is very meaningful. You know, I think about, you know, the Orthodox theologian Vladimir Lossky's definition of tradition. Tradition is the life of the spirit in the church. It's the way that God has worked through human institutions, human mistakes, human terribleness, human greatness, to, you know, kind of bring and distill the faith to us today. So, you know, across Catholic history, you've had moments of reform. You've had moments of attempting to restore things that have been lost in different ways. Protestantism as a project was a much more radical version of that. So one way that I tend to teach this in the classroom, when I teach, I talk about Protestantism briefly in very early on in my Intro New Testament class, and I put it in conversation with the origins of the field that I work with, biblical studies, where, so one of the key events, period, in the foundation of academic biblical studies was the fall of Constantinople. And the reason precisely was because that event led to thousands of Greek refugees going, you know, west in Europe, right? Ending up in places like Italy and Spain. And when they arrive, they take their Greek manuscripts with them. And, you know, Greek, of course, is the original language that these texts are written in. And when they come with their manuscripts, Latin-speaking scholars look at the manuscripts and realize, this is somewhat different from the manuscripts that we have in Latin. There are differences in the wording, differences in things. And this led to a larger project of trying to recover the original text of the New Testament, and essentially to critique the Latin Bible and compare it to the Greek Bible and attempt to discover, it's the origin of what we in biblical studies call textual criticism. And that's a very revolutionary move, like I tell my students, right? I mean, because to pick up your sacred text and to believe that it might have an error that needs to be corrected is the Pandora's box for a lot more change. And so it's not surprising that you can just fast forward a few decades, and that entire exercise of let's get back to the original text is also let's get back to the original church, the original way this should be done, the original way this should be taught. And that's what Martin Luther is fundamentally a part of, right? He's, in a certain sense, an academic of the 16th century who's raising questions of, well, why do we do it this way? And should we be doing it this way? And so it's interesting, right? To see Protestantism as, growing within a very deeply historical experience, but reaching back in ways that obviously the Catholic Church also was reckoning with at the time too, which is why, Protestants, we think of a Protestant Reformation, we also think of a Catholic Reformation that's occurring simultaneously in a more conservative vein.
Right. Cool. That's a nice breakdown. So now for you, back to your personal journey. So now you did your undergraduate at in linguistics, was it?
No. So I did my undergraduate degree in English.
Okay.
I'll tell you why too. I went off to college. So I was raised by my parents, in Protestant environments, and Catholicism was always something that I knew was in our history as a family. But by the time that I was old enough, it was kind of an other sort of thing, right? It was not something that I had a lot of experience around. My parents went to lots of different churches. They went to Pentecostal churches, Baptist churches. At some point, my mom made a connection with Seventh-day Adventists. And when I was around 12 or 13, I actually started getting more active in the local Seventh-day Adventist church. And my parents had stopped attending there, but I wanted to actually stay with it. And so that was a really unique thing that my parents let me attend church myself as a teenager, all alone, while I went somewhere else with the siblings. And it was, kind of for me, this way of, at probably an earlier age than some, taking responsibility for what I believed, what I wanted to practice and do. So I was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist. At least where I raised myself.
and for folks who aren't familiar, it's my understanding, I saw a documentary that was on Amazon Prime not too long ago, where that they believe that the day of worship should be Saturday, not Sunday.
Yeah. So it was literally like I go to church one day and my parents went to church the next.
Right, and it's because they say that it seems like they blame the papacy for a lot of stuff, right?
Yes, right. So Seventh-day Adventists have a very clear notion that the papacy is the Antichrist.
Right.
And, so I grew up, completely with these sort of anti-Catholic assumptions being thrown at me at all times.
Sure.
For me, the turning point, I'll mention the fact that, so I ended up going to a Seventh-day Adventist school for college. And the idea was that during my teenage years, I was thinking ministry made some sense. I clearly liked religion, and I kind of only saw one career that involved it, which was whatever I was seeing every weekend. So I decided to go to Southern Adventist University in Tennessee, which I went because it was good at placing Seventh-day Adventist ministers, and that was the idea. But I completely sabotaged myself and that goal the weekend before I left for college, when I decided to go to a friend's church. So I had gone to prom with a girl who was Antiochian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Georgian background. And, it was one of these things where she always talked about her church, always talked about her faith. And the reality is I didn't know a thing about Eastern Orthodoxy. I knew a number of Eastern Orthodox Christians because that's growing up in New York. You kind of meet everything and everyone. I think that was actually the biggest thing of what it means to be a New Yorker for me, just the diversity that I don't always tend to see everywhere else that I've lived. But yeah, so I decided, yeah, I'm going to go visit her church. It was a liturgy, right? An hour and a half long, pretty much exclusively in Arabic. I mean, I remember just little snippets of English at like the announcements and
Mm.
things like that. But it was taking in an utterly foreign religious tradition in an utterly foreign language for me, certainly in what I had grown up with in Spanish and English. And yet, I was just kind of blown away by it. I didn't understand half of what was going on. I didn't know why they were doing what they were doing. Looking at the icons on the walls, looking at the ritual movements and everything, understanding smelling incense. I mean, it was just really, really foreign and strange and odd. And when I left with just questions. What was this? What does this mean? It's one of the hardest things. I have a friend of mine who says, speaking of the Catholic world, but this could extend to Eastern Orthodoxy, this isn't really a good child's faith because it's sort of so built up, so complex. There's so many moving pieces to it that if you want to understand what's happening, you kind of need to get really deep into studying it. It's not always self-explanatory why Catholics or Eastern Orthodox Christians do this way, this time, etc. So I left with a host of questions. I spent the next several months reading voraciously anything I could to try to contextualize that experience. It brought me for the first time face to face with so many aspects of ancient and medieval Christianity that I had just never thought of, been exposed to. Understanding the evolution of church worship over the centuries, understanding how so much of what we call tradition actually developed, always really in response to practical necessity. There are reasons why things evolve the way they do. And I remember loving being that deep into history and then realizing that it was something that I kind of put my finger on. I felt like I was missing in Protestantism. I don't think that every Protestant necessarily lacks that perspective. Like you mentioned, certainly there is at least always some, your expression was cherry picking, right? Of actually at least looking at the Council of Nicaea or looking at something like this. For me, I just wanted the full immersion in it. And so within a few months, I kind of realized I was on a trajectory somewhere more ancient. I ended up becoming Byzantine Catholic. So I ended up, and it was kind of this marriage of two different realities. It was how deeply influential that Eastern Orthodox exposure was for me, but also my strong sense of Catholic roots and wanting to find something that bridged the two. So Byzantine Catholicism, Greek Catholicism, which are essentially Eastern Orthodox communities that several centuries ago reunited with the Catholic Church, but retained their traditions, was sort of the ideal center of the Venn diagram for me.
I see. It's interesting. When I saw your Twitter profile, you identify as a Byzantine Catholic, and when I think Byzantine Empire, you think of something very like ancient, or at least like during the time of, like, you mentioned the fall of Constantinople, right?
Yeah.
Within it, the Ottoman Empire. There's a Turkish show that I'm addicted to. If you ever want to learn Turkish, by the way, there's an excellent series called Resurrection Ertuğrul on Netflix, right? So this is pre-Ottoman, but like they're always like the Byzantines are one of the people they're engaged in war with, right? So are there people still identify as Byzantines, or is this something that you're like kind of trying to like resurrect that identity? Like, what's really going on there?
Yeah, well, it's safe to say that Eastern Orthodox Christians center the Byzantine Empire in their history, right? I mean, for 1,000 years, right, this really was interwoven with what it meant to be Christian in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'll say the reason why Byzantine Catholics get called Byzantine Catholics, or traditionally Greek Catholics was the expression, but that gets lost in the American context. And that and some financial government legal issues made the church that I belong to, the Byzantine Ruthenian Catholic Church, in the 1950s adopt Byzantine as a safer, non-ethnic looking label. Really, the church that I belong to has a Slovak Ukrainian heritage. It's all straddling the Carpathian Mountains. It's purely an accident of geography that that's the tradition I ended up in, but I sort of love it. It's
Yeah.
all this kind of folk chant, folk harmonization. It's a lot of fun, and yeah, and there's something the church in the United States. I mean, Eastern European immigration to the U.S. was late 19th century, so the church is so thoroughly Americanized that kind of any vestige of ethnic trapping has sort of been lost over the last 100+ years. It was a very comfortable home for me.
Okay.
I'll say
Well,
one other
go
thing
ahead. Yeah.
that actually for me really worked about Byzantine Catholicism. So, there's something very cynical at the center of the Byzantine Catholic project, right? The Greek Catholic project. Again, these were communities who hundreds of years ago reunited with Rome. And they really did it for political reasons. I mean, it was, Orthodox Christians who found themselves in the Austro-Hungarian Empire under a Catholic empress, and who, for political reasons, decided we're going to be Catholics now because that's a bit safer. They're letting us keep all our traditions, but we don't offend them anymore, and we have legal protections and legal registrations we didn't have. And I think that kind of cynical, jaded core a little bit to Greek Catholics is actually really sort of refreshing, because if you take Roman Catholic Christians of a certain kind of dyed-in-the-wool form, if you take Eastern Orthodox Christians in a certain form, I mean, there's strong triumphalism in both of these churches, right? There's really this notion that the Roman Catholic Church is the one true church. The Eastern Orthodox Church is orthodoxy, and everything else is heresy, heterodoxy. And these are churches that are so historically linked, so entangled. It's almost ridiculous to have that strong dichotomy between them. I've enjoyed this kind of middle position of feeling like I can participate in things that are Roman Catholic, while recognizing that Greek Catholics have always been this source of critique of Roman Catholic practices. I can participate in all of the history and heritage of the Eastern Orthodox world without thinking that Rome is this awful, terrible, evil church entity that for some reason lots of my Orthodox friends imbibed at one point or another as an idea.
I can certainly see the reason, that the wisdom of using the term Byzantine as well, right? Yeah. Because, Greek can be like, it has the semblance of tradition, right? And I think that's that's really the thing. And to me, when I sometimes look at the American version of Christianity or Protestantism, like, and I've spoken to some of my friends who come from the East, maybe African churches, and they say it's like, it seems to be completely like watered down and capitalistic in a way, or, there's a different, the flavor is different. Because what you guys are talking, when you're talking about the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church being like the bastions of Christianity, like that's, to me, that's because they seem to want, the goal is to honor the tradition and not just dismiss it, and just like, versus what you see sometimes in America is like this desire to like reinterpret Jesus in this like super, like, I don't know how to say it, but like this completely like modern way. You get what I mean? And if the goal is to try to understand what Jesus was really about, and what the disciples were really about, what the early church was really about, to me, logically, that would be where I would gravitate towards what you're talking about. Like the churches that had the tradition, because what I notice now is that somebody today will literally like pick up the Bible, and it seems to be very acceptable, and pop it open and read a few chapters and like, well, this is what it means. I think it means this. Not understanding there's a tradition behind it, not understanding that there's like context. It's almost like, in a way, that people are completely unaware that this book is compiled over like hundreds of years, right?
Right, yeah.
And there's different books that came from different times with different authors, and they're reading it chronologically in a way kind of bereft of that. You understand what I'm saying?
Right. Or not recognizing how historically contingent and contextualized their own encounter with this text really is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you pick up, so again, I teach New Testament, I teach early Christianity here at UNC with Bart Ehrman, right?
Right.
And I know when I teach, I constantly want my students to be aware that you're picking up this text today after the Enlightenment, after the scientific revolution, in the United States, in a capitalist society. I mean, and all of these different influences have something to bring to the table in ways that you really can't perceive how they shape your encounter with this text. I mean, and one of the kind of simplest, sort of ways, I mean, so there are certain passages in the biblical text that seem to associate angelic powers with stars. And my students always have a little trouble understanding that connection, except like I tell them, like, you assume that stars are balls of gas burning billions of miles away. I'm so sorry to like Timon and Pumbaa this kind of part. But you come in with these sort of post-scientific revolution assumptions of the world and the universe around you, and those didn't exist in the ancient world. There is no notion of what stars are other than your potential non-Christian so-called pagan neighbor who looks up at Jupiter and associates that with spiritual power, divine power, entity, and you're trying to make sense of that as an ancient Christian as well. There's just so much, it's putting ourselves in our place, putting the text in its place, and then trying to kind of build the meaningful bridge between those two. That's all of what I think gets short-circuited potentially when you're opening up this text and picking your finger on a certain verse, right?
Sure. Now, why the English major?
Oh yeah, I apologize. Yeah, so I sabotaged myself. I wanted to go be a Seventh-day Adventist minister.
Right.
By the time I arrive at college, no, crap, I'm suddenly realizing I'm actually changing religions, apparently.
But you did the 4 years, you finished up the 4 years there? Because like you could have transferred after a year, right?
Well, I finished in 3 years, and I finished in 3 years because I wanted to get the heck out of there. I really should have just transferred somewhere else. I didn't. So I was a first generation college student. I think my mom was in college, but definitely college graduate.
Right.
And so I just didn't know how this landscape worked. So I decided to drop the theology major because it was a bad fit. I didn't need Seventh-day Adventist theology day and night. I decided to go to English for absolutely no reason in the world other than it looks like a major in the humanities, and I think I like that. There's definitely things that I gained out of that. I really appreciated, everything I learned about literary theory that still informs how I do biblical scholarship today. I ended up doing, after I graduated, I took a year off. I ended up doing a master's degree in religion at the University of Georgia for no other reason than I didn't know what the next step was going to be. And I thought, religion is still something I want to explore. This is the local state, university, and let's just start there and make that kind of point A on my journey of what am I going to figure out.
I want to backtrack real quick on your undergrad. You realize before you started at what was the name of your undergrad institution?
Oh, Southern Adventist University.
Southern Adventist, right? So was it like insufferable to be around your classmates once you realize or is that something you just kind of like, is it assumed that if you're going to that school, you're Seventh-day Adventist?
Oh yeah, totally. It's like 98% of the student body. And it's not just I'll be honest. It's that a lot of the students grew up in an Adventist bubble. They've been through Adventist education at all stages, from Adventist elementary schools to Adventist boarding high schools. And I was coming from a public school background. I mean, again, the one interest in that school was, if I want to be a minister, that should make sense. Not so much. And then again, when you combine that with, I was leaning towards ultimately becoming Catholic in an institution organized around a very anti-Catholic perspective, it was just a pain. I ran for student government and people were taking down my posters because I was a Catholic. It's like I'm Al Smith or JFK or something like that.
Yeah.
It was, because again, the fact that I was so open with, yeah, I'm, been Seventh-day Adventist, but I'd like to explore Catholicism. That was the unforgivable sin. If I had just come in saying, oh, I'm Catholic, everyone would have been my friend trying to convert me. I'm the opposite. I'm the guy who left. So
Yeah, you apostated, so to
yeah, that's
speak.
right. That's right. So I found the departments that were a little less insufferable.
Right. Okay. It's your social life and all that that suffer as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I think every breakup I had in college ended up being a conversation of how you're becoming Catholic. Yeah, I'm becoming Catholic.
I really didn't realize they were that prominent. With they had their own schools and universities. That is interesting. I didn't realize that. Because when I had saw their documentary, I was like, okay, I see where they're going with it. But when I started Googling it, man, everyone was like, it's like cults and all this stuff. But so I figured it was kind of like a smaller movement. But I guess there's enough folks to actually have a proper university.
Yeah,
So
it's 20 million people. And in
okay.
a religion of 2 billion, that may not be a ton, but yeah, you can definitely build up institutions.
Sure. Okay. So now you go into Georgia for your master's in religion, just kind of still understanding you're interested in religion. You got an English degree. But like I guess when you're going into Georgia, what were you thinking? You just wanted to get another degree because you're like let me just take the next step and see what happens.
Yeah, I was entirely trying to find out what I wanted to do. And I think part of it was just that I didn't have the best mentoring at the time. I mean, I think this was just perpetually my issue in my education, that I'm a first generation college graduate, right? Or, and so it's just one of these things where I just didn't know the lay of the land. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I took classes. I didn't know and have anybody telling me, how do I find the one thing I want to do? So I did a whole bunch of religion classes, a lot in Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, some in New Testament. I did some in, other kinds of areas. And I'll say that I sort of did that degree still a bit confused by exactly where I wanted to end up. What happened was that in that 2-year period of my master's degree, I met my future doctoral advisor, major professor, Jared Klein, who taught in the linguistics program, then linguistics program, now linguistics department at the University of Georgia. He's housed in classics. And so Jared is one of the most intelligent people on the planet, period. He is a scholar of Indo-European. I mean, if there is an Indo-European language, he knows it, he has studied it. His courses the last few years, I mean, it's Old Irish, Classical Armenian, Gothic, Hittite. I mean, he's all over everything. And he had been working on a project for 20 years of looking at the way that the New Testament was translated into languages like Old Church Slavic, Gothic, Classical Armenian. For a linguist, it's a really interesting topic because, if you think about this, the Bible is usually the first text that ever gets written in any of these languages that's preserved for us today, because most of these languages ultimately got their alphabets from Christian missionaries who brought writing with them precisely to communicate Christianity. So if you're interested in comparing Classical Armenian or the Armenian branch of, Indo-European with Latin, with Celtic, it's going to bring you back to the Bible in a certain sense and biblical translations. And so it just kind of seemed like a lot of what I might be looking for. It was the biblical text, but it was moving outside of the biblical text. It was a really sophisticated exposure to language and linguistics. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Now you mentioned first generation college graduate, and generally, so I no, I'm my parents are college graduates, but it's almost like seeing like I want to do something like liberal arts, but I went to engineering because of something practical. There was never pushback from your family, like what are you doing? Like doing this degree that's gonna get you no job with no money.
Yeah.
You never got that?
Well, so the only thing that helped that was the fact that I was getting the degrees funded. Like
Okay.
you get an assistantship or whatnot, or a
Okay.
fellowship, or yeah. So that was fine. They were okay as long as it wasn't going to cost money. But yeah, my mom totally grew up with this whole idea that I was going to business school someday. I remember begging her to take French in middle school, and she's like, "You'll never use that in business." And I'm like, okay.
Yeah. I actually could see you being an investment banker. You have the look. You could I could see you like with a nice suit and everything. You kind of got like the Saturday banker look right now.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
You know what I mean? It is kind of clean. But okay. So yeah, I was just curious because like a lot of times people who like are able to pursue academics like the way you are, they like I found they traditionally come from backgrounds where the family has money, where they're more they had that there's less because there's a lot of folks like may have an expectation that you're gonna have to support the family later, not just yourself.
Yeah, right.
And and to go into those kind of fields. Okay, so
and that's still there. I think yeah, I'm definitely supporting my family.
Okay.
But,
yeah,
fortunately it worked out.
I guess at that point, yeah, but like I think when you're kind of just finding yourself, when you're going to Georgia for your master's and again trying to find out what you want to do, it's not because my understanding is jobs in academia are hard to come by, right? That's what everyone says, especially in like the humanities, social sciences. So all right, so that's kind of, so it sounds like that's kind of your exposure to like language and the New Testament, all this stuff going on. So when do you start do you start learning languages next, or what happens with your master's?
Or with the PhD when I'm doing the linguistics now.
Oh, so you did your PhD's in linguistics, okay?
Yeah, master's is in religion, PhD's in linguistics. So I'm in the linguistics program, and right, it's language learning fundamentally. I mean, it was 3 semesters of Sanskrit. It was, right, all these, classical Armenian. It was, all of these sorts of pieces. And my major professor, my doctoral advisor, it was just absolutely the most intimidating professor on the planet. I mean, our Sanskrit, our final exam for Sanskrit, the final exam was worth 70% of our grade for the semester. And it was a 600-point exam where every point was a word or a form you had to produce. And if there was one diacritic mark wrong, the word was wrong. The point was lost. I mean, it was insane the amount of work that I had to put in. But it's just, he's just that kind of professor.
And this was at Georgia?
This is at Georgia.
Yeah. So this is like probably, and I want to, how's the experience like at Georgia? Georgia's like, a big, you go from a Seventh-day Adventist like undergrad, and now you're at this big SEC school, like state school in Georgia. There's like, football's like king there. You're probably there. I'm trying to like think who's Georgia has some decent teams, of course, in football and whatnot. How's the experience like as a PhD student there doing this linguistics thing, which is obviously sounds to be very intensive, while trying to balance like what's going on with like campus life?
I loved it. Yeah. I loved it. I mean, so it's not my undergrad, but it's totally my alma mater. I mean, like it really is the school, the brand that I plugged into. And I think especially the contrast to my undergrad really helped it. But it was an environment where, subjects were taught freely without this entire mantle of confessional everything. The Catholic community was vibrant. I really loved, I love, and Athens, Georgia is an amazing town, right? It's the music scene, it's it's everything about that town was just great. I loved the college town.
Okay. So when you learn language, how many languages do you know right now, would you say?
I can at least say how many languages I've studied. I should count them up, right?
That's a good disclaimer, because studying something and knowing something are two different things.
Well, and it's like, my doctoral advisor was really a realist on this and kind of notes that, when you learn a language once, you know how to get back to it if you need. But it's just the nature of our minds to, if you're not actively teaching it and actively researching in it, it's going to go dormant. It has to go dormant. I mean, it's just the mind works that way. And so, yeah, I know my way back to probably a dozen languages or so. Wow. And that's the nature of it. I mean, I can't do that count off the top of my head right here.
Right. So like something like Sanskrit though, like was that required for the curriculum?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're not going to do Indo-European without Sanskrit. Yeah.
Okay. Because like I'm trying to connect the New Testament to Sanskrit, and I'm like, oh, what's the connection there?
There is absolutely no connection. Yeah.
Okay. So when do you decide that you're going to get into the New Testament stuff? Like that's going to be your field. How does that work out?
Yeah. So this is what good mentoring would have helped me determine sooner.
Sure.
Right. So, I remember I would do all my PhD work in linguistics.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what would I do? I would be sitting down and reading about early Christianity. And that's what I would do on my free time. And so that works for a lot of different fields and lines of work. It does not work if you're going to be a professor. Because when you become a professor, you eat, live, breathe what you study, right? And teach. I mean, you just think about the publication expectations, which means that when I'm off the clock in teaching, I now need to keep thinking about issues that I'm publishing about, that I'm going to be researching. And I just had this weird split where I would do the linguistics during the day and I would move back to early Christianity reading in the evening. And so the real pivotal moment was the date of my doctoral defense. I finished my dissertation and et cetera. And they've invited me out of the room while they make their decision about whether or not they're going to pass me. They invite me back in the room. And like the first thing out of Jared's mouth, my doctoral advisor, was, okay, well, we're passing you, congratulations, but is this really what you want to do? And it was the most shocking question to get on the last day, literally the last day of your doctoral program, after you put in, several years into this. And it was this kind of moment that just elicited the honesty on my part of, I don't think so. And it started this entire discussion between me and my committee where, I kind of told them, I actually really feel as if I should have done something like religious studies. I actually really enjoyed languages. But to put it this way, I was using the biblical text to study a language, when probably what I always wanted to do was use languages to study the biblical text and its culture and its world and its history and its reception. And the equation was in the reverse. And, I told them, is it possible to transition? I mean, and everyone, knowing the job market realities, knowing the fact that entering a bad job market with the wrong PhD also seems like a complete disaster. I mean, they kind of put their bravest face on, probably not. One of my committee members gave me a story or two that was meant to try to help inspire me of, well, weirder things have sometimes happened. But I left there, I graduated, and it was yet another year at home.
So you're talking this is a 4-year, how long did it take you to get your PhD?
Yeah, it took me just over 4 years. I was really efficient and focused.
Yeah, because that's typically for humanities. I understand it takes most folks, it could be 6, 7.
Yeah.
Or average. Okay. So during the 4 years, again, is it you mentioned the mentorship. So you're saying you're first year PhD program, you're doing linguistics, and at night, how would your day look like? You go to class, you'd finish your whatever homework or whatever. I don't know how grad school is, but then, okay, I assume your time is probably limited too. You probably don't have all that free time. What do you read? What kind of book would you read in the evening? Would you listen to a lecture? How would you study early Christianity? What would you did you have a methodology or?
Yeah, no. I mean, I would read books. I would read articles. I would type out ideas as I'm engaging these things.
Okay.
If I had a free credit hour, I would try to take it in the religious studies department again, and just kind of keep it. And I always sort of viewed it again as sort of, I guess this is this hobby, or maybe it's going to enrich what I do. But
right.
At some point, I had to come down on, this is actually who I am. And this is, if someone could have stopped me years ago and said, and this is what I always tell my students, what you do on your free time, if you want to be a professor, that's what you are. That's what you do. That's what you love. That's what's going to animate you to do everything you do.
Okay. But do you think, looking back now, that your background in English and linguistics has helped you in how you are now a professor of the New Testament?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think it gave me an appreciation for literary perspectives. It gave me a language base that no New Testament scholar ever has, right? I mean,
yeah.
You take Greek, you take Hebrew. You don't tend to take, Sanskrit and Akkadian and all these other kind of pieces necessarily. Because I also did a minor in Semitic languages. And so it just worked out for me. It really did. The other thing that it gave me too, and this is something I really appreciate in my own scholarship today, is it gave me So the fact that I didn't go through a standard New Testament PhD means for me that I can be really iconoclastic. I have no doctoral advisor in this field that I'm here to impress. I didn't come out of an institution whose history I'm protecting. I love having original ideas, and I love pursuing leads that nobody else is picking up. And it's fun to be a bit iconoclastic with everything. Yeah.
Okay. Now, obviously, the odds weren't looking good for you coming out of Georgia with a PhD in linguistics and wanted to kind of get into the New Testament, into,
Yeah.
a religious, a job in religion or in academia. But it seems to have, kind of like things worked out kind of well for you. It seems like, how did that transpire? You end up at a pretty strong program, my understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. I am grateful to God for the fact that I believe that I'm in the best of all possible universes.
Yeah.
And I took the most circuitous route to get here, right? So I finished the PhD, and I didn't know. So in the United States, we don't tend to do second PhDs, right? We don't get funded, so that's not really a thing we do. So I thought, so what do I do next? So I knew about roughly there are such things as postdocs. I didn't understand much more about them than what the term told me, right? They come after your doctorate. And I decided to apply for several exclusively in religious studies. I kind of decided, look, I'm going to do religious studies. If I'm not going to do religious studies, I'm going to just be a priest, because I'm going to stay close to what I love. This is what I'm going to do. But I really want to see if I can make a field being a researcher working in New Testament early Christianity. So, in any kind of way that worked. So early on in the process, I realized that if I wanted to do this, I needed to associate myself with a fantastic program. And I knew that Yale was, literally as fantastic a New Testament site, early Christianity site as I could imagine. They also had strengths in early Christian worship and liturgy ritual, which was an interest of mine beyond simply, biblical studies. And so I looked at one particular postdoc, targeted it very strongly. And the key kind of moment for me was I knew that the people who were picking this postdoc were going to be at a certain conference. And I decided I am going to put together a few $100s and I'm going to go to this conference, period. And when I arrived, I heard that someone had dropped out from presenting a paper. So I asked, could I present a paper? And they were like, yeah, sure, actually, that would be helpful to us. Why not? I had introduced myself to everybody there as, I did my PhD in linguistics, but I'm interested in seeing if I can't transition to religious studies. And everyone was friendly, but with the same kind of,
skepticism. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I present my paper. And the way this works is that you pre-distribute the papers and then you have 30, 40 minutes to debate your paper. And that's what emerged. It was just a debate where people were discussing. It was a paper that I presented on 5th century Jerusalem, feast days, etc. I'll leave it at that. And it was an incredibly lively discussion. I was getting attacked on multiple fronts. I was fighting back on multiple fronts. And all that I understand is that when the dust cleared, someone in the room was from Yale who had a direct say on that postdoc. And they told me a year later, oh, that just proved we had to invest in you. We had to make this work. Like you just know too much. You're too good. We've got to make this work. So I ended up going to Yale for this postdoc for 2 years through the Institute of Sacred Music there. And that was where the mentoring was great because they were very clear with me. Okay, your doctoral dissertation is completely illegible in our field. You need to essentially write the equivalent of another dissertation, just write on a new project. So I wrote on the reception and cult of Stephen in 5th century Jerusalem. The other pieces of advice were, okay, so you need short-term credibility to be successful in the job market. So publish articles, just publish. You don't have a lot of coursework in New Testament early Christianity. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to teach full-time, several semesters here, so that you accumulate teaching experience at Yale so that you can present that to other institutions and say, yeah, I taught this at an Ivy. I can do this. And that was brilliant. It brought me to UNC, where I did a second postdoc because I knew that there would be a possible transition to faculty here. I'd actually gotten a job offer before the same year that I had the UNC postdoc offered, like a tenure track job offer. I turned that one down because I realized I had a research gene. I was really, really interested in coming to Chapel Hill. And then 2
Yeah.
years later, I ended up as a professor here.
Okay, cool. So it seems like at Yale, you probably didn't sleep much.
No, yeah.
That sounds crazy, like what they had you doing, right? Because it's almost like you're cramming a second PhD in without calling it a PhD.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. That's what it sounds like. Okay, so cool. So now you're UNC. So UNC, if I understand, it's like is known for, if correct me if I'm wrong, their the New Testament department there is more like a historical approach, whereas other school like a Duke might be like interpretive approach. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're a religious studies department, right?
Okay.
So yeah, and I would say that so definitely historical, cultural approaches to religion. One of the things that really works about UNC is that most of our faculty did not get PhDs in religious studies. There are 20 of us. And by, I think the last count that I heard, only 2 actually have religious studies PhDs. You know, there are people who are trained in anthropology, in classics, in, of course, linguistics, area studies. And so it was a great fit for me.
Oh, cool, interesting. So now your article, which I want to kind of get to, and it's very it's kind of a technical article, and I'm trying to, it took me some time to read through it. I was like, I'll be honest, as a non-academic, as an engineer, it was kind of dry, but I'm like trying to get through it because of the implication of it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's about the Johannine community, like the community that, if as a layman again, that the authors of the Gospel of John and 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John wrote for, right? There was because that's kind of like the theme for the layman. The New Testament is kind of like, it's written for people to proselytize to, in a way. Is that a simple way of putting it?
Yeah, I can try to break it down a little bit.
Okay.
So I'll take the article, the Johannine community piece.
Sure.
So Christian Bibles have 4 books that bear the name John. There's the Gospel of John, which is an account of the life of Jesus, a biography of Jesus, essentially. And these 3 small letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John.
Sure.
These texts are really similar to one another. If you read them, the language is strikingly similar, and they're very different from anything else in the New Testament.
Okay.
And so the question is, how are they related? So for ancient Christians, these texts are anonymous, but ancient Christians looked at how similar the language was, and they thought, this must have been written by the same author. And they saw that author and identified him eventually with a known disciple of Jesus named John. Later on, you get to kind of modernity, and scholars are looking at these texts, and what they notice is the Greek here is pretty different from the Greek there. Like 1 John and the Gospel of John just do not look like they're written by the same hand. But the question is, why are they so similar? And so the answer that they develop, the biblical scholars develop, is that if these texts don't come from the same author, they must at least come from authors who knew one another, who moved in the same circle, right? If you read 2 different texts that both talk about worship and call it mass, you would have a sense that these 2 individuals belong to the same religious tradition, and that religious tradition is probably Catholicism, right? So kind of in a similar way, these texts have certain key words in common, and scholars have thought that, these texts must have come from the same community, tradition, the same movement or sect within.
Okay. So it's more like the authors, it's not just because all right. So I have a couple questions here, just to help you understand. How could the early church have missed the fact that, because they identified it as these are similar books. These are similar. When you say similar, you mean as far as like theology, what they talked about? And then the later scholars realized that as they analyzed it deeper, that the writing style and nuances in the Greek were different. Is that really the difference there?
Yeah, right. In the sense that they share common theology, common ways of expressing the theology, light, darkness, children of light, abiding in God, all these very, doing the truth, these turns of phrases you find nowhere else in early Christian literature.
Okay.
At this point,
So, and then to clarify, so it is generally accepted that the authors, while being anonymous, are from the same community, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, again, when someone, to define things, so I've come across that when people talk about like how the Bible is, the textual criticism of the Bible, there's conservative and liberal, because some people would still argue, if you ask a confession, like maybe a confessional, maybe apologist, they would argue that no, we believe John wrote John and also first, second, and third John, right? Would that versus someone else might say no, it's anonymous. How do we reconcile that difference of opinion? Like, why is one group so like firm, even though they may not be in a minority, even though they may be in the minority on that? You get what I'm saying?
Might try that again.
Yeah. So it's basically like, okay, so you're saying that most scholars would say that they're anonymous, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that the 4 books are written by people in the same community, right? Because that's what it seems like. Is that in scholarship, that's what's agreed upon, more or less, would you say?
Right.
Okay. So now, but then you find people who also are studied, or they may have PhDs, but they're more on maybe they're apologists, maybe they're more confessional, in that sense. I don't know if confessional is the right word, but or they identify themselves as more conservative towards the text. And they would argue that no, John, the beloved disciple, wrote all 4 books, right? So how do they reconcile that with like what scholarship primarily would say? Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
I'll stop here for a second.
Sure.
Kind of entire piece, and I'll also just ask. I mean, was I clear enough in introducing this? Because if we want to find a better way into this complicated topic, I'm happy to do that as well.
If I understood correctly, right? So if I understand correctly, right? So there's 4 books with the name John. There's Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, right? And I'm gonna like, that part I can kind of cut out, but so it's understood by the majority of scholarship, biblical scholarship, that while these books, the authors are probably, we don't know for sure who they are, but we could safely say that they're probably from the same community. Mm-hmm. Are we good there?
Yep.
Okay. Now, but then you've got people who maybe are outside of academia, or maybe they're like, you call apologists, so to speak, and they would more or less insist that no, John wrote John.
Yeah.
And also 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. And so do you know what their rationale is in light of the general scholarly consensus that no, we don't have authorship, we have a general trend. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, right. So there are still, so this is a field where we have a lot of more conservatively inclined scholars.
Okay.
Not least because they teach in institutions, not unlike my undergrad institution, where, I mean, they have to uphold a certain kind of denominational confessional perspective, right?
Yeah, right.
That perspective is, usually that the text is true, it's inspired, it's infallible in all of its details. So at the very least, I think a lot of these kinds of scholars look at this text and they see that the gospel says it's written by a disciple of Jesus. It says that in chapter 21, verse 24. The disciple is anonymous in this text, but they will often appeal to this tradition. Maybe this is a bit like the cherry picking you're talking about, where there is a tradition in the ancient church that this is the Apostle John's work. That's certainly the title that comes down to us today, and that's what they receive. It's a way of making sense of what the text itself claims, coupled with what tradition says.
Okay, that makes sense. So now your your article is that, I guess people perceive it like people say, oh, Hugo Mendez says the Johannine community doesn't exist or never existed.
Yeah.
But I want you to really define on your own terms what you're talking about.
Yeah, I sort of bury the lead in there. I mean, so the article is totally a test balloon for me
Oh,
for a much larger intervention. And right. So if you've never looked at my article before, someone out there listening to this, um, it kind of begins as a discussion of this issue of the Johannine community, which is purely a scholarly concept. But ultimately, the headline is, I think the Gospel of John and the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are a chain of ancient forgeries. They are a literary tradition of forgery. The Gospel of John claims to be written by a disciple of Jesus. There have been scholars for a couple, decades who have always thrown out the idea that there's something fishy, though, about that claim. My article says, yeah, a disciple of Jesus, an eyewitness, did not write this text. That is a false authorial claim. It's a false identity, if you will.
is that what they call pseudo? What's that? What's that term? That term with a P.
Yes, epigraphy. So this is an issue. Yeah, so this is this issue that we get a little bit at UNC. So if you know Bart Ehrman, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you've had him on the show before.
Right.
So Bart's piece, he wrote Forgery and Counter Forgery in 2012 and a pop work Forged. And I completely agree with him that pseudepigraphy is a term that is just really, it's almost meant to shield what we're talking about from people who aren't in our field. I mean, it's not clear enough. But no, I think they're forgeries. The way that I use these terms is I think pseudepigrapha are any texts that are written under another false name or identity, one other than the author's. I think that forgeries are those who are pseudepigrapha that are doing that to deceive their readers, that they actually want the readers to be thrown off the scent, to be misdirected. And I think that's actually most pseudepigrapha. I'm just not willing to say all of them are.
Okay. And so you're including the Gospel of John in that?
Yeah. So the Gospel of John, I think, is a forgery. I think it was written by an author who was not a disciple of Jesus, who was not an eyewitness to Jesus, but who decided to write a gospel, a biography of Jesus, and who decided that the best way to give his work credibility and authority was to pretend and to make his readers think he might be an eyewitness and a disciple.
Wow. So this is even pushing beyond it's one thing to say that the Gospel of John is anonymous or doesn't have authorship, right? But we still have a general idea and the essence of the gospel is still true. But when you say it's a forgery, and I've read when I've read the New Testament, I've read the Gospels, right? And I see that you have the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And then John is very different. Yeah. It's stylistic and everything. And it's and from my understanding, as I'm reading it, I was like, well, certainly, and the Gospel of John tends to date later, right? Mm-hmm. And certainly, I would have assumed that the writer of the Gospel of John obviously had access to the earlier 3 Gospels. Is that a safe assumption to make?
Yeah, we didn't used to think so in the late 20th century, but in the last 10 years, we've realized most scholars actually think so, and I'm one of them. But I think he knew the other 3.
So he knew that, and then he kind of has this different. But what are the implications though theologically though? Because the Gospel of John has the highest Christology, mm-hmm. right, of the 4 Gospels, and that's what I'm kind of interested in. Is how do then, if you believe it's a forgery, how is that reconciled for you as someone who actually as a Byzantine Catholic?
Yeah, because I'm a practicing Christian. I'm religious. Yeah, right. And I experience this text in multiple different ways. I think that's safe to say.
Right.
So I'll say this, right? On the one hand, since I teach in a religious studies department, religious studies as a field is kind of a set of compromises historically, right? I'm in a public university. Separation of church and state means that we're taking a secular, disinterested perspective, et cetera, et cetera. It still hits you on a personal level. For me, I'll say that I mediate all of this through my own Catholic faith and perspective. I think that everything about the way that a Catholic sees time, history, the way God has worked in history is just the understanding that God has worked through some very imperfect people and circumstances,
Right.
to understate it, right? I mean, you think about forgeries like the donation of Constantine. You think of just his messy history, ugly historical personalities. I mean, Constantine, these kind of figures who are hardly really floating 6 inches above the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, I sort of accept that as part of the fabric of my religious history.
Yeah.
The one that I build on for 2,000 years, that, God works through imperfect, messy, ugly, scandalous circumstances and still finds a way through it. And it's precisely because God is at work with human beings. And, if he can't work through them, he sure as heck can't work through my life, I would think.
Yeah. So cool. Sorry. Sorry to cut you off. You keep, if you had to keep going, I didn't want to cut you off.
Come on. Yeah, whatever you got.
Okay. So it almost seems like if you're a Protestant, this would have caused much more problems for you. Would you agree with that statement? I
think if you have, so we're getting back to maybe that thing about unmediated access to a text that's just kind of a given historically. I mean, if that's kind of your posture, then yeah, I mean, I'm shaking the Bible at the basis of the sola scriptura, Bible alone kind of mind. Yeah, and I do think as a Catholic, I won't say that Protestants can't make these turns, because there are different ways of doing it. I just think that as a Catholic, I have a certain kind of resource at my disposal, which is this notion that, just God uses messiness across history. And so, right, I can imagine an ancient author who had really important interventions to make in the history of theology and how Christians think. And I can think that this author used a technique that I'm not especially happy with, let's say, myself doing morally, ethically, whatever it is. But he did. And somehow it has been woven into our faith and life and tradition. And I think that was part of a larger design and plan, if that makes sense.
Sure. So let me ask you a kind of a direct question then. So would you say then that the Gospel of John is not God's word?
No, I would definitely not enter into that territory. I mean, in the sense that I do think, let me make that clear, right? No, I do think it's God's word. I do think that, so I'll say, so some of this is really nuanced and attenuated, right? So the Bible is a human product. Right? Let's just get right there, right? I mean, people wrote it. People over time selected what they were going to be using in churches. Right. People hundreds of years later decided to put it all together under one set of covers and publish it for us today. It's always been a very human book. And with that, I think it's had human mistakes, human issues. I mean, we can talk about the science, we can talk about historical facts and, mistakes. And I think that I certainly stand on this kind of post-Enlightenment critique of this text that recognizes, no, I don't expect a text written in the Bronze Age to understand the universe for me in my contemporary terms. I think that this text can make a mistake. I think these were human authors that made mistakes. So, but I do think they're God's word ultimately, in that I do think they reveal fundamental truth. I think that they are certainly part of the church's ongoing dialogue, discussion, and discovery of truth. And I see that as an unfolding process across 2,000 years. Okay, so let me try to reconcile this and try to understand. So let's say the person who wrote the Gospel of John, was not the Gospel of John. It was a forgery. However, he was still inspired in a way. And so the essence of the text is still true. Is that a right way to say it? Can I say that? Well, and maybe even to take it one step a little bit. I think that the way that Christians read this text is true, if that makes sense. Whatever the author had in mind, whatever the author did, I think ultimately what's important about this text is not even that moment where someone's writing it. I think it's the moment where it becomes read in churches. It becomes part of the biblical canon and text we have. It's the way that later Christians have interpreted it, where, like you mentioned, in the Council of Nicaea, I mean, I promise you this, the first century author of this text was not trying to determine Trinitarian theology, but something about the text, what it reflects, what the church recognized in this text, the way that the language of the text helped the church articulate its own emerging, evolving views about Jesus, about God, has worked for Christian history. And I think that that is, if you will, really even the center of what divine inspiration and being God's word is about. It's about its living present relevance for the church.
It's almost like, and I've heard this before, and it's almost like the Holy Spirit is infused within it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where you get that. Okay, interesting. Now, have you gotten pushback from Christians about this article?
Yeah, I mean, so I've at least gotten to see how, right. So, I mean, the article, kind of at first glance looks like an interscholarly discussion, but you start reading a few lines of the abstract and you realize I'm going really into a very different kind of interpretation of these texts. And,
right.
I mean, because even scholars who have thrown around the Gospel of John might be a forgery or whatever term they prefer, haven't done it with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John usually. My article is saying 4 biblical texts are forgeries. And that's a pretty significant number. I think the most interesting Twitter reactions and different things that I see are, people who don't understand my own religious positionality and don't understand that, no, yeah, I mean, I'm not here attacking anyone's faith. I'm a Christian scholar who is looking at these texts, who's trying to make sense of the linguistic features I see in them, the connections and parallels between these texts. Yeah.
And I wonder also if people, or because you're at UNC, you're a colleague of Dr. Ehrman, if they're automatically like, oh, this is just another younger version of Dr. Ehrman, without understanding that, yeah, you guys come from different religious experiences, right? And so it's almost like how it's interesting because what you found out to be your conclusion keeps you Christian. But for someone else, it could shake them out, right? Yeah. Have how you look at things, because that's really fascinating. So, and I think the question that people would ask is, and I get this too, because you find out about these different like revelations. Like, for example, you have when you study in academic circles, right? I have friends who are like PhDs in Islamic studies, and they're coming across new things and fleshing things out, and then people were like, well, like, is it almost you're kind of skeptical in a way, because there's this notion from a layman's perspective that people in academia you're incentivized to come up with new innovations. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
Because that's going to be revolution, and religion is like, oh man, this is 2,000 years of religion, and why they got it? Are you saying they got it? There's a defensiveness. Like, you're saying they got it wrong, and now you're coming in 2020 with some new thing.
Yeah. So it's funny because I experience this a different way. Like, I get that, right? Because there's kind of this assumption too that just being a scholar, you're going to be more intrinsically skeptical and critical when you really shouldn't be. But no, I mean, if you look at the landscape of biblical scholarship, I mean, there are just so many people in our field who teach in institutions that have confessional constraints. You have to sign up to a certain, confession of faith. Most people who tend to study the New Testament tend to be Christian, because if you're going to obviously be this invested in a text for the rest of your life, it might as well be a text that's meaningful to you, right? So you probably came to it from the reality that it's meaningful to you. So I don't know, I tend to find something else. As someone who was trained in a different field, but has really just kind of worked his way into New Testament, I think the inertia in our field is a fairly safe conservative one. It's one that can do certain critical moves, but is really nervous about doing too much to rock the boat. And I think the Johannine community is kind of one part of that sort of safety net, in the sense that, I mean, the idea may seem really weird to people who have no exposure to all of these scholarly discussions, but the notion of a Johannine community is ultimately about protecting the idea that there is a link back to Jesus, I think. There's this notion that the community was founded by a disciple of Jesus in most reconstructions. And so maybe a disciple of Jesus for some scholars, didn't actually write this text, but it is linked to his authority. It reflects his views. Community is such a vague concept that it allows for that link to occur, where I'm just suggesting, no, or it could have been one author somewhere out there who decided to do something a little funny with his pen.
All right. Well, on that note, I appreciate you coming on the show, man. Is there any final thoughts? I know you guys just started. You mentioned you're a Georgia guy. You guys just benched your starting quarterback last week. I don't know if you saw that, right? Any predictions for the upcoming season?
I mean, I don't know. Georgia will always disappoint me right about the time. I mean, so I like the whole idea of an all SEC schedule, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so partly because I'm a complete SEC triumphalist here.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I think this is the power conference.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. They always kind of find my way to break my heart sometime around the South Carolina game, usually time of the year.
I mean, really, the year they got screwed was when they couldn't cover 4th and 26. Was it 4th, 26? 2nd and 26, sorry.
It's been a whole series of these. I mean, like I remember 2012 and the game against Alabama that came 4 yards short. I mean, it's just
right. Yeah, it's almost like, and then I'm an Ohio State grad, so you guys just gifted us Justin Fields.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So I appreciate that, but I am concerned about the season actually finishing because it's like so sensitive now. And I was watching the LSU Mississippi State game last week, and like they had like 20,000 people there, but nobody's wearing masks in the stands. I'm like, whoa. I'm in Illinois, and in general, you go outside, you're wearing masks, right? I don't know how it is down south and stuff, right? But like, no, cool, man. I really appreciate you coming on. My condolences. At least the Islanders made a decent run, I guess. Better than.
I mean, it's the first time since '93 they've made it that far. You got to be happy. The Mets were just a complete dumpster fire. Yeah, and the kind of the broad question for me is how legitimate. So I think the NHL worked. They played most of the season. I thought the bubble was a real success. I think the baseball season this shouldn't count. But yeah. Sure.
Right. And NBA's looking, so I'm hoping to tune in the finals tonight, right after this show. If people want to reach out to you, how can they do so? If they want to learn more about your works, what's the best way?
Yeah, sure. My email works. So hmendez@email.unc.edu works really well. I do have a website, hugomendez.com, which will have my contact information on there. And yeah, happy to get in touch.
All right, Dr. Hugo Mendez, we really appreciate it. For our listeners out there, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Pocket Casts, and then follow us on YouTube, social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. For my special guest, Dr. Hugo Mendez, I'm your host, Mahim the Podcaster, signing off for Sultan Sneakers.